Hello. In this section of the course, we're going to look at, well, what do you do with the audio now that you've created it? So ultimately, it depends on what your own plan is and what it is that you want to do. I'm going to describe 3 places that somebody taking this course might be likely to publish their audio. The first that we're going to talk about is, let's say you've created a podcast, maybe as an assignment or a project. And you're going to upload it to your university's VLE, virtual learning environment, Moodle, Blackboard, whatever. We'll come back to that. Another is that you're going to make this podcast available for the world to listen to in all the various podcasting apps, in which case it's likely that you're going to be using a podcast platform such as Acast or Spotify for podcasters. And I'll give you an example of how to upload that later on. Or you might want the audio to be available for people to hear, but not necessarily on the podcast apps. In this case, you might use one of the many audio platforms out there, such as SoundCloud. There are other options too. For example, you might want, if you had your own web server, you might want to self-host the podcast. But that's beyond the scope of this short course. However, before that, I want to explore some of the meta information that is tied to podcasts. As well as the audio, there's a bunch of meta information included with a podcast. Now, the diagram here shows some of them. This is far from an exhaustive list, but I don't want to overload you. For the purposes of this course, I'm going to focus on artwork and description, both series and episode descriptions. There are others. There's things like text transcriptions, promo videograms, social media elements, etc., etc. I'm not saying these aren't important, but they're beyond what we can do here. If you're interested in that, you can search things out yourself. For example, with transcriptions, I've used a number of tools. I find Otter.ai has been pretty good for AI-driven transcriptions. I see Apple Podcasts now will do that for you as well. It can be a bit hit and miss, and a lot of these systems struggle with accents, strong accents, particularly Irish accents. But it's certainly better than starting with a blank page and typing out what people say. For videograms or audiograms, I've used Headliner to create those for years. Pretty good web-based system. Those are 2 starting points. There's lots of others out there. If you're interested in social media, I'd recommend looking at some digital marketing material. But again, that's really outside of my area of expertise. So we're just going to talk about artwork and the descriptions, the text descriptions. So in terms of artwork, again, the example here is The Machine. This artwork has kind of evolved over the years. I think in the very first season, back in 2018, it was a series of RGB red, green, blue color lines and an old video game font. This newer one, the file is 3000 by 3000 pixels. I'm going with a flat design style. The title of the podcast is clear, and the imagery, of the kind of monitor, computer, and its circuit board, hopefully conveys that this podcast is about computing. Some podcasts will have pictures of the hosts as the artwork, which can be very appropriate for personality-driven shows. The Machine artwork that was created in Photoshop, but you could use any package you want. I know people who've used Canva or Pixelmator. It really depends on what it is that you want to do. Unless you're a graphic designer and you've got a vision, I'd say go with something simple and clear. It's likely to be viewed on a small smartphone screen, so there's no point in trying to pack a load of text in there. It won't be seen. Some podcasts will have series artwork, and then they'll have custom artwork for individual episodes. If that's something you want to do, it's entirely up to you. But again, I would always suggest that people start simple and work up to things. If you're using a hosting engine for your podcast, like Acast, Podomatic, or Podcasters for Spotify, they'll give you specific details about how the artwork should be sized and guidelines as to how it should be submitted and things like that. Next up, we'll talk about the descriptions. This is the text information that goes along with the podcast. There's the series description, which is the overall description for the show. And again, the example here is from The Machine. Faculty and students from the South East Technological University, SETU, Ireland, explore a wide range of topics related to computing and technology, hosted by Rob O'Connor, All opinions are personal and do not represent university views. There's a little disclaimer there at the end. So that's if you search for The Machine on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you'll find that text there. And obviously the title of the podcast is The Machine. It's actually got a tagline, a computer science education podcast as well. Now, every episode also needs a title. So here's the title of a recent episode that we did. Indrakshi Dey, who's a person, Autonomous Systems and Artificial Intelligence. The description is the text description for individual episodes. Sometimes people call it the show notes as well. And this might be longer. So what you're going to see on the next slide is the text description for the episode relating to Indrakshi Dey on autonomous systems and artificial intelligence. So there you go. That's now you can read through that yourself while I'm talking. What it does is it kind of gives somebody a short description as to what the podcast is about. As you can see, we're talking about AI and different types of AI technologies. And also, we also discussed Indrakshi's career, about being a woman of colour as well, and her insights into that. And then what I like to include in podcast notes is links to where somebody can find more information. In those cases, they're organizations that Indrakshi is working with, her profile on LinkedIn and my profile on LinkedIn. It's not that I'm, particularly self-promoting, but if somebody wants to get in touch, they can find us through that. So you would need to write a description. You need a title, a description for every episode. You'd need an overall series description if it's going to be a multi-episode arc. But there you go. This shouldn't take you too long to write, and you'd usually write this after you've finished editing the podcast and you know exactly what it's about. If you're going to publish something to a VLE or an LMS, a virtual learning environment or a learning management system, that's something like Moodle or Blackboard or Brightspace or Canvas or whatever your university uses. It's probably because you've had an assignment that's been set by a lecturer or professor to create a podcast. You're just probably going to upload the MP3 audio, maybe the artwork, maybe the description, and you're done. I'm not going to go through examples of this because every VLE will be different and every module will be set up in their own way, and every individual academic will have things set up in their own way. However, if this is what you have to do, it's likely that you have experience of uploading material to the VLE anyway, so it's just audio instead of maybe a PDF. Now, publishing to a podcast platform is different. This is where things basically move into the professional realm. So if you're going to publish to one of the many hosting podcasts, if you're going to publish to one of the many podcast hosting systems out there, each one is slightly different. The general gist of it is the same across all of them. There's lots of platforms. Some of them are free, others cost money. Some have a free tier and then paid for premium options. Which one you would use would really depend on your own circumstances and use case. You'd obviously have to create an account on the platform and do all that setup. I'm not going to go through that here. It's pretty self-explanatory and specific to each platform. There's usually guides on how to do this for each one. For The Machine, I originally hosted it with a system that was called Anchor.fm, but a number of years ago that was bought by Spotify, and it's now part of their Spotify for Podcasters ecosystem. Later in this section, there will be a short video in which I demonstrate how to upload a podcast for The Machine to Spotify, the Podcasters for Spotify system. So I will show you how to do that. If you're doing it to Acast, it'll be slightly different, or if you're using Spreaker or Podomatic, there's loads of these systems out there, and I'm not going to advocate for any one over the other. I just use Spotify because we've kind of grandfathered into it from Anchor.fm. Good friend of mine uses Acast, has a really good experience with that. All of them will manage the RSS feed for you and distribute your podcast to the various listening apps out there, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Pocket Casts or whatever it is that you use. If you want to get your material on YouTube, It is slightly more complicated, and I'm not going to get into it here, but there are tutorials that you can find out there if that's something that's important to you. Finally, you might want to publish to a web-based audio platform, but that's not necessarily geared towards podcasting, but you want your material to be available out there. Now, there's lots of other audio platforms out there on the web. They won't necessarily create an RSS feed, but they do have some nice tools where you can listen to the audio. Somebody else can listen to the audio via a link. And also you could maybe embed an audio player on social media or another website. SoundCloud is pretty good. I've been using SoundCloud for years to host random bits of audio. There's other alternatives out there like Mixcloud or AudioMac. If you're a blogger, maybe in WordPress or something like that, you could just upload your audio, your podcast audio to your blog and go from there. Why would you use one of these and not one of the podcasting platforms from the previous slide? Well, maybe you've just produced some demo audio, or perhaps you're finding your feet and you'd like some feedback from people before pushing headlong into a full podcast series. So last year, I had 2 students start a music podcast, and before they started publishing it properly, they recorded some demo episodes and they sent it to me and other people for feedback. So they were using SoundCloud. In that case, it was kind of easier they just sent a SoundCloud link. I could listen to it, send them on some notes. And it's easier to send a SoundCloud link than it would be to maybe send a large MP3 file as an attachment in an email. Just like with podcasters or Spotify for podcasters, elsewhere in the course, I'll show you an example of how to upload a piece of audio to SoundCloud. I'm not advocating SoundCloud over any other platform. It's just that I've been using it for years, and it does have a free tier option as well. So publishing your audio so that others can hear it, it's not particularly complicated. There are a few steps you'd have to go through. The specifics would depend on which services that you're using. All of the platforms will have step-by-step guides or instructional videos showing you how to post material online. I suppose it's really up to you to choose the most appropriate platform for you and then work accordingly. Okay, thank you.